Hello everyone, this is Valerie Anderson, your Director of Communications and Programming. I'm here today at my Kissimmee office and mini studio here with Jean, who is in and around Weeki Wachee. Jean is a conservation biologist with a long history of working to conserve natural Florida. He worked as an environmental lands planner for the Southwest Florida Water Management District, where he helped identify lands to be protected through the Save Our Rivers, Preservation 2000, and Florida Forever land acquisition programs, and also played the lead role in writing land management and public use plans for the acquired properties. After 16 years at Southwest Florida Water Management District, he spent 5 years serving as the conservation planner for the Florida chapter of the Nature Conservancy, where his research included modeling of sea level rise impacts to major estuaries of the Gulf of Mexico. He is currently semi-retired, remains actively involved with the Florida Native Plant Society, where he currently serves on the board of directors as chair of the Policy and Legislation Committee. And Jean and I are also working on a sort of small series of videos on sea level rise impacts to the Gulf Coast. So look out for those in the near future. Take it away, Jean.
Right. Thank you, Valerie, and thanks everybody for joining us here today. I hope we can make this a constructive use of your lunch hour. As Valerie mentioned, we are working on putting together some multimedia uh, information on sea level rise. And to this point, it's focused on the area where I live, the Big Bend coastline. I'm hoping that after I finish my presentation, I might hear from some of you about things that you see along your piece of the coastline. If the audience out there is representative of the Native Plant Society's membership, then you're scattered all over the state. And if you're distributed according to the way the population of Florida is, about 40% of you should be residing in what's considered coastal areas. So I'm familiar with the natural systems and sea level rise impacts that I'm seeing here on our coastline, but I'd really be interested in hearing what some of you might be seeing in other parts of the state. So I really hope we do have some time to share that. I'd like to also mention that the Native Plant Society Conference in 2019 was conducted in Crystal River. And in association with that conference, we, as always, we had a number of field trips, but I helped conduct one with Dr. Jack Poots. He's a professor at the University of Florida. You might have heard him on a lunch and learn about 3 or 4 weeks ago. He was talking about his sandhill restoration efforts on his property, his yard in the Gainesville area. And he's done an awful lot of research on sea level rise on this coastline. He helped lead the field trip that I was starting to mention when we conducted it as part of the conference. We went to the Yankeetown area, and he guided about 25 of us through the salt marsh and hydric hammocks, and really helped us understand what we were seeing. He's done a lot of research there, as I mentioned, a lot of graduate students over the years. And to this point, I think covers a period of record of about 25 years or maybe even more. So it's some of the best research and documented evidence that we have of sea level rise impacts on the coastline of Florida. I'll go ahead and share my screen with you now. Okay. So I want to start. I, all right. Okay. I'd like to start by giving you a sense for the kind of coastline we have here in the Big Bend region, because it is pretty distinctive. When people think of the Florida coastline, they usually envision barrier islands and beaches. Our coastline is more typically like what you see here, a lot of salt marsh. And I'd like to share some diagrams that I think kind of explain why we have the kind of coastlines we have. In this particular slide, I borrowed this from a very useful reference, an ecological characterization of the Florida Springs coast. It was published in 1990 by Department of the Interior. And this particular image shows a map of the sandy coastlines of Florida. And you might see that there are two large regions. I'm using my pointer to show you, this is the Big Bend region, and it doesn't show any of that sandy coastline. And then also the southern tip of the peninsula, the Everglades region, also absent of sandy coastline. And what is it really that explains that? This next slide kind of picks up where that first one leaves off. And it shows where we have salt marsh. And so this region defines the Big Bend salt marsh. And it's indicating energy of wave action. And so you'll see around the perimeter of the peninsula in northeast Florida, you have moderate wave energy, high around most of the rest of the east coast. On the Gulf, southwest Florida, moderate. And then bracketed between these areas of low energy is zero energy coastline. And that is the Big Bend. In essence, there's so little wave energy that it can't move sand. And so that's a pretty gross oversimplification, but that's why we have extensive areas of salt marsh instead of sandy barrier islands and beaches. This is still looking at our coastline from high altitude. This is a satellite image of the southern Big Bend, about the southern 1/3 of the Big Bend through Hernando and Citrus counties and a little bit up into Levy. And this is where I'm really going to focus the rest of my discussion. I have just done kind of a back of the envelope calculation, some acreages, and those are calculated for just the area that we're looking at here, the southern 1/3 of the Big Bend. So you see, we have nearly 250,000 acres of seagrasses, about 130,000 acres of salt marsh and brackish marsh, and 150,000 acres of hydrocamic and pineland. And some other things I'd like to point out using my pointer. Up here at the northern end in the Wackasassa Bay area, this is where the Wackasassa River drains into the Gulf. South of there, Crystal River Kings Bay system drains into the Gulf. Then we have the Homosassa River further south, the Chassahowitzka River. Here at the southern end is the Weeki Wachee River. So there's a whole lot of water, fresh water, gushing out into this coastline. It's often also called the Springs Coast. And that's one of the reasons we have a really vast estuary here, an estuary being where saltwater and freshwater mix. Typically they're closed systems, bays, the more typical estuaries we have, like the Indian River Lagoon and Charlotte Harbor and Tampa Bay, Pensacola Bay. Another thing that is really important when you look at this section of coastline is the amount of natural area that's been protected here. So at the northern end in Wackasasa Bay, we have the Wackasasa Bay Preserve State Park. It's about 50,000 acres. South of there, we have the Crystal River Preserve State Park. We have St. Martin's Marsh Aquatic Preserve, Chassahowitzka National Wildlife Refuge, the Chassahowitzka National Wildlife Wildlife Management Area, and the Weeki Wachee Preserve owned by the Water Management District. So what's really significant about that in terms of sea level rise is there's going to be room for the coastal wetlands that are going to be swamped by the rising sea to migrate inland. So it's possible that we will continue to have a healthy functioning estuary if those wetlands are able to migrate inland. We're going to get a little more up close and personal with the salt marsh now. This great blue heron is feeding out there on the edge of the marsh, and the vegetation you see at the front is cordgrass, spartina. Behind that is the black needle rush, Juncus romerianus, and that's very typical of what we see in our marshes here. They are dominated by graminoid plant species, and here are the four dominant ones. The salt marsh cordgrass, Spartina alterniflora, is typically found in the deeper marsh areas, and then upgrading of that, it transitions into black needle rush, and then beyond that, saltgrass. I have sawgrass here. It does occur typically in the most inland portions of the salt marsh, and that's because it's really more a freshwater species. And this diagram is a pretty gross oversimplification, but generally it does illustrate that here at the left side, and you have the deeper marsh dominated by a fringe of cordgrass, then upgradient of that, the black needle rush, followed by the salt grass. This doesn't really indicate an area of sawgrass, but typically that would be right there at the most inland edge of the salt marsh. The photograph that you see in the upper right is also kind of typical of this coastline. At the really highest areas scattered within the salt marsh, it's high enough, dry enough that we have forests develop, and those are hydrocamic forests. They're pretty diverse. This is a variant on that hydrocamic that I refer to as maritime hydrocamic. It's further out in the marsh, so it's more under the influence of salt. And actually, I do want to just back up to this diagram again. It's the zonation that you see in this vegetation is not just a function of elevation and with it exposure to the tides and to inundation. Salinity is also a major factor. So as I said, you're not typically not going to see sawgrass unless it's pretty far inland and more under the influence of fresh water. I mentioned all those spring run rivers. There are, basically a countless number of small seeps and creeks that also drain into this coastline. So just massive amounts of fresh water. And that's really the sole reason that we have estuarine conditions on a coastline that is basically open and continuous with the Gulf of Mexico. So looking at this maritime hammock, you don't see much diversity in these forests because they are so subject to salt, occasional inundation, salt spray. And so the tree species we typically see would be cabbage palm, red cedar, and live oak. They're the three hydrocamic species that are most tolerant of the salt. Some of the other species we're commonly going to see in these marshes, this perennial glasswort, Salicornia, and also saltwort, Batis. Those are typically found in areas that are more hypersaline. They can be inundated by the tide at high tide, and when the tide recedes, the water can remain there, ponded there, and as the water evaporates, the salt is left behind, and that just tends to concentrate the salt and create hypersaline conditions where there just aren't that many plant species that can survive. Other plants that we'll see, and these are more typically right there along the edge between the marsh and the forest, Christmas berry, Seoxeye daisy, marsh alder. One of my favorites, seaside gentian. The seaside goldenrod, it's going to town right now. Yellow necklace pod. Overall, there really isn't a lot of plant diversity. This is a system where you can really learn all the plants if you spend some time studying it. What I want to do now is talk about the impacts that I'm seeing. And after I do that, I'm going to briefly also show you some of the outputs that were generated by the modeling work that I was doing when I was with the Nature Conservancy. I think you might see that even now, the impacts that are evident are pretty dramatic. So the image on the left, it looks like two islands. It's actually the same one that you see in that series of images on the right, kind of a time-lapse series of aerials. I downloaded these from Google Earth, and you can see that the image at the top, October 2006, it looks like one island. And as you continue down through time, through 2013 and 2017, it looks like something's going on there. So I'm just going to zoom in on the island a little bit more. This is actually looking at it in December 1998. Sorry about the quality of the imagery. It's not the best, but that's what was available. If we go, but it is clearly, pretty densely forested, continuous canopy, one island. This is the same exact land area in December 2004. About 6-7 years later, 2011, and you see the canopy is really thinned out in the central reaches and along a lot of the margin. Here it is in March 2016. So it looks like two islands. And as you'll see in the next photo, this is standing in the middle of the island looking out towards the marsh. You can see that black needle rush off in the distance, the foreground. It's a nice thick carpet of salt grass. And those cabbage palms that you see, those are the corpses from the past 30 years or so of sea level rise. This is the view from basically the same spot looking inwards towards the interior of the island. So at this point, half or more of the cabbage palms on that island have succumbed over the last couple decades. And referring back to the work that Dr. Poots and his graduate students did in Wackasassa Bay, they found that long before the dieback of the canopy became obvious, they could see that there was no reproduction going on, no recruitment. And they were able to correlate that with increasing insalinity. And as a function of more frequent inundation, they also figured that one factor might have been some periods of drought, so that the salts that were accumulating in the soils from the additional inundation, the more frequent and regular inundation, the salts just weren't being diluted and washed out by regular rainfall. A couple more views from the island, looking down in the saltgrass on the left, but the one to really pay attention to on the right, those cabbage palms. These are some of the cabbage palms that remain, and they appear like they're pretty highly stressed. They're not really all that happy. So I'm going to go to Wackasassa Bay, the region where Dr. Poots has done a lot of his research, because what we see there is really a lot more dramatic. And this is just a couple islands. I haven't been on these. I just used Google Earth and kind of explored what's going on in Wackasassa Bay. And these are two islands in March 2006. The canopy looks, it's a little bit patchy. And that's because, I think that the effects of sea level rise are already manifested to a certain degree. Moving forward to January 2012. And here we see it in 2016. No trees left on those two islands. That's between the two, that's about 1.5 acres of forest. Now you can do this yourself. Just go and use Google Earth and the option to use some of the historical imagery, and you'll see that there are many hundreds, probably thousands of acres of these maritime hammocks that are completely gone now. And just like you see here, it looks like just a bunch of matchsticks laying down inside the marsh. Here we go. This is the most recent imagery, February 2020. Now, the Florida Native Plant Society, a couple of years ago, we reviewed and commented on a management plan that was updated for the Wackasassa Bay Preserve State Park and Crystal River Preserve State Park. And what was most disturbing was they really weren't doing much in the way of addressing sea level rise. And we recommended that at the very least, they need to be monitoring, doing some of the kind of work that Dr. Poots is doing, so that we can really see, quantify the changes that are taking place, so we can understand what it is that's going on. The modeling work that we did at the Conservancy, we used a model called SLAM, the acronym Sea Level Affecting Marshes. And it simulates the dominant processes of inundation, erosion and accretion, saturation. It's been used to model the projected impacts of sea level rise for nearly every estuary in the Gulf of Mexico. And that's largely because it's a pretty easy to use model. There are much more sophisticated models out there now. It's a lot more work to do it, but there are researchers that are using those models. And as with any model, you know, they can be useful. They can give us a sense for what's coming, but you really need to, it can only be as good as the input data that you have to feed the model. I don't want to delve too deeply into this. I don't want anyone to try and read all the fine print on these. I'm just going to point out the major take-home lesson, if you will. So this is looking at the SLAM output for just the northern half of the Hernando County coastline. And it's based on projected impacts from 1 meter of sea level rise between now and the year 2100. In the upper left corner is the initial condition, which was actually back around the year 2000, late 90s. And the large area of green that you see is hydric hammock inland. Offshore of that kind of burnt orange color is the salt marsh. And the kind of time-lapse series that you see here as you go through 2025 and 2050 is the salt marsh is moving inland and basically replacing some of the hydric hammock till you get down here to 2100, and it projects that half or more of the hydric hammock is gone and has been replaced by salt marsh. So the encouraging thing, if you will, is that we still have salt marsh because it is migrating inland. This is a little bit more scary. This is output from the modeling we did in Wackasassa Bay. And this comes from a publication that Dr. Poots actually co-authored with us. And the thing to keep in mind here is when we did the modeling, we assumed 1 meter of rise, and we also ran the model assuming 2 meters of rise between now and 2100. And projections now are that we can easily expect 2 meters, six feet of rise between now and 2100, and quite possibly more. And what's really important about that, I think what the model really drives home, if you look at the map on the left, the color scheme is a little different here. That light green is salt marsh. Inland of that, the darker green is hydric hammock. And you can see here, Wackasassa Bay, really broad expanse of salt marsh. And that's after 1 meter of rise. Now, if we look at the output from 2 meters of rise on the right, we see the immense difference that additional amount of sea level rise produces. So virtually all of the hydric hammock that you see after 1 meter of rise, it's gone after 2 meters. And you do not see very much salt marsh. And the actual outputs generated changes in acreages, and salt marsh declined by upwards of 80%. So the difference between 1 meter of rise and 2 meters of rise is that there just isn't an ability for those systems to migrate inland, because before salt marsh can become established, there's more rise coming behind it. And basically that the rates of erosion and accretion, erosion is so much greater that there's no ability for the sediments to accrete, for the plants to migrate inland. I don't want to forget the mangroves. Those of you in the southern part of the state, you really don't have the same kind of salt marsh coastline that we have. Instead, your estuaries are dominated by mangroves. And we do have both black mangrove and red mangrove occurring on this coastline. And they are in fact expanding. That's part of the story, part of the change that we're seeing. In this view, you can see some of the black needle rush marsh, and growing in around it is mostly red mangrove and some black. And in this part of the state, we're really at the transition zone between where mangroves dominate and salt marsh dominates. I think you could accurately say that mangroves are the tropical analog to salt marsh. So we have historically had freezes that were severe enough, cold enough, and long enough in duration that they would periodically kill the mangroves. And over time, they'd start to move back in. But we're not really seeing those kinds of freezes anymore. And one of the elements of climate change that really dictates how plants and plant communities will respond, it's defined by the extremes. So in this case, we don't have the extreme freezes that will hold the mangroves back. Now that isn't to say that we won't ever have those kinds of freezes again, but with warming, we might expect that they will become less severe and less frequent. And so I do have a series of photographs here, just taken from our back deck. The image on top is from November 2009. And you can see the mangroves coming in, but you also see quite a bit of the black needle rush. In the image below, the same exact area, you can barely make out any of the black needle rush. And in time, if we don't have any of those freezes, the salt marsh will be replaced by mangrove. What does that matter? Is it a good thing or a bad thing? That was a point of discussion during our field trip with Dr. Poots. I can tell you what we have here: Marion's marsh wren and Scott's seaside sparrow. Those are two endemic bird species that are restricted to the salt marshes of the Big Bend. And it's going to be important to them. Go back to that slide that showed the projected impacts of 2 meters of rise in Wackasassa Bay. And if you're a species that's entirely dependent on salt marsh, it could be a pretty serious problem for you. Going back to, is it a good thing or a bad thing that mangroves are coming in? We kind of settled on, it's just a thing. I mean, it is natural in that they're not non-native species. They're not invasive. Their niche is such that you would expect them to occur here. So as climate changes, so will the plant species that we would expect to occur. Now, I took this photo just a couple months ago. We had a big fire, and you see all the smoke make out a little bit of flame. And This is a view of the marsh that burned, about 180 acres of black needle rush, mostly black needle rush, burned in that fire. And one thing that I'm kind of curious about when we think about how we might adapt to sea level rise, in particular along this coastline where we have that transition occurring with mangroves moving in and perhaps overtaking the marsh. Marshes are subject to fire. It's a natural event. And mangroves are unlikely to tolerate fire. So whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, at some point we may have to consider measures like prescribed burning in the marsh to keep the mangroves at bay so that species like the Marion's marsh wren will still be able to persist here. There are a couple other endangered plants I'd like to highlight, and before I start talking about some of the wildlife species that are likely to be impacted, the Florida pine root, it's listed by the state as endangered, and that's one that we consider to be imperiled by sea level rise. The hydric hammocks and to some extent the pine flatwoods where they occur right along the coast are definitely going to be under the gun as sea level rises and salt marsh moves inland. Perhaps even more at risk is corkwood, Lightnaria floridana, listed by the state as threatened. And you see its range there in the range map. It's pretty much limited just to the Big Bend. Like all those range maps that we often look at, it includes entire counties. So it's instructive to consider that really the habitat for this species is kind of the transition zone between salt marsh and hydric hammock. And so that's the area that's most under the gun. So a species that has that narrow habitat range to be right there at that interface between the salt marsh and the hydric hammock, that's one that we should be monitoring and trying to see what's going to be happening long term. I'll talk about some of the animal species that we identified that are at risk here on this coastline due to sea level rise. There is an experimental population of whooping cranes that were established at the Chassahowitzka National Wildlife Refuge. They apparently spend a lot of their time in the marsh and eat a lot of blue crabs. Other species in the brackish and salt marsh, besides the whooping crane and the Scott's seaside sparrow and Marion's marsh wren, which we already mentioned, we have the Gulf salt marsh mink. A lot of people may not be aware that we even have native mink species. The Florida salt marsh vole, and I highlighted that in bold on this slide because that particular species, it's only known from a couple locations around Wackasassa Bay and Cedar Key, federally listed as endangered. I think it might not even have been observed for a number of years now. So it's very rare, only occurs in those salt marshes. We have our own subspecies of Gulf salt marsh snake. I put manatee in there with a question mark. They do occur in these marshes. If we lose marshes, that may affect the suitability of these areas for manatees. And of course, hard to know how that might tie into their use of those coastal spring run rivers like Crystal River, Kings Bay, and Homosassa River. In the hydric hammock forests, take you back to another one of those model outputs where it showed the hydrocamic nearly disappearing in areas. We have a large number of active eagle nests in those hammocks. We also have a population of the black bear. It's probably the most imperiled black bear population in the state, and that is one of the most important habitats for them in this region, is that hydrocamic. So projecting out, not just those imperiled species, the uncommon species, but blue crabs, red drum, diamondback terrapin, just about any kind of fish, any species of fish that is popular for recreational fishing or commercial fishing. I've read variously that from 70 to 90% of all the species in the oceans that are valuable for commercial or recreational fisheries are dependent on estuaries for at least some part of their life cycle. So if we do not have healthy functioning estuaries, it's really going to have a major impact on our fisheries. And before I open it up to some questions and maybe hear what some of you are seeing in your part of the state, I did want to compare and contrast our Big Bend coastline, where we really are blessed to have all those natural lands that have been conserved through public ownership. What you're looking at here in this slide is an aerial view of Tampa Bay. It is the largest estuary in Florida, hugely important in all kinds of ways, for shipping and certainly for fisheries. In contrast to that aerial view that you saw of the Big Bend, where are these coastal wetlands going to migrate as we face 1 meter or 2 meters of sea level rise between now and 2100? And I often like to ask or think about when we use benchmarks like that, 2 meters by the year 2100, what happens after 2100? Sea level is going to keep rising. So, I mean, it is time for us to really accept this as, we're confronting a come to Jesus moment. And I have a couple more slides here. This is an article that just came out, just a snippet, don't try to read it, October 14th, just a couple days ago. And it makes mention of how within 20 years, rising sea level is going to affect the bonding capacity of coastal counties. So when we hear about Florida being on the front lines of sea level rise, how it's going to impact our state so greatly, they don't look at the natural systems like we have done to this point in this presentation. They're talking about our developed coastline, our cities, and this image shows flooding in a town in New Jersey. But I wanted to highlight some of the text here at the bottom. It's referring to the credit risk from rising sea levels. It's more frequent and severe flooding threaten coastal communities, economies, property values, and critical infrastructure. There's nothing there about fisheries. There's nothing there about habitat. But moving on to this slide, this was published in the Tampa Bay Times yesterday. And you can find something nearly every day now if you go out there and read, whether online or in your newspaper. It's all over it. And it always looks at our developed coastlines. So the picture you have here is someone who works for Monroe County, and she's holding her hand up a short distance above the paved road. And they're talking about how they're going to be sustainable and adapt to sea level rise. She's holding her hand where they're going to elevate the road to that point. And you have to wonder, scratch your head, how's that going to help? How much is it going to accomplish in the face of 1 meter or 2 meters of sea level rise? I know in Miami, we often look to Miami Beach, where the mayor has been working to help the city adapt to the sunny day flooding, as they call it. Much more regular flooding from the tides. And so this is just yesterday, they've approved a $400 million Miami Forever bond to invest in storm-resistant infrastructure and climate-adaptive construction and zoning reforms. Nearly $500 million. And I am not suggesting that cities and counties should or should not be engaging in these kinds of efforts. But I really think that we need to look more deeply at how we're identifying the threats, how we are going to adapt, and recognize that some of these projects, they may not be well conceived. They're not really looking far enough ahead to what's going to come. And that is the last of my slides. We still have 15 minutes left anyway to stay on track for questions or observations. And so let's get into it. Are there any questions out there, Valerie? Oh. Can you hear me? Okay. Take it off that slide. I don't like looking at that one.
Okay. Let's see. If you can stop your sharing. Okay. So we have a question by Margaret, who has not identified where she's at just yet. She says, when you say that the salt marshes migrate inland, are you saying that there will be a net loss of salt marsh areas?
Good question. And some of the modeling that we did under the 1 meter scenario, it showed an increase in total acreage of salt marsh. So species like salt marsh snake and the wren and the seaside sparrow, they might do fine. But what's frightening is when the model projected that under 2 meters of rise in most of these estuaries, there was just no ability for sufficient amounts of accretion for those plant communities to migrate inland. They basically just became swamped. And instead of seeing increases in salt marsh, we saw pretty vast increases in tidal flats.
Good question. Good answer. We have an observation by Jen, who grew up in both coasts, actually, in Pensacola and also Palm Beach. And she says she observed that they have red mangroves growing on the backside of St. George's Island in the Panhandle. They started around 2000 and it's 2006, but they have not been killed off yet and have slowly started to spread.
Interesting to watch and see if they get knocked back by future freezes or if they just continue to advance and expand.
Were you aware, Gene, that they were that far north in the Panhandle?
I was not aware that there were red mangroves up there. Uh, Quite a bit of black mangrove. I think that's of the mangrove species. I think that's the one that's most tolerant of cold. So it is significant that the reds are there now.
CJ Taylor has a question about what was the publication in New Jersey? What was that publication?
The source of the story, I think it was Moody's, about bonding capacity, projecting that local governments in 20 years could have a hard time getting the bonds they need to do this infrastructure work and all these adaptation projects that they have in mind. It just won't be a good investment.
Karen Willie, who gave a recent Lunch and Learn, is on with some observations that I was at Leffis Key this morning, which is in North Sarasota Bay, 1 hour after low tide of 0.3, and all of the paths were flooded, higher than the usual high tide. Sea level rise is going to come in pulses, and she thinks that there has been a pulse recently.
You know, we live on an island and have to drive a 2-mile causeway through the marsh to get home. And 20 years ago, once or twice a year, stretches of that road, the low stretches, would be underwater. And now it's almost a monthly occurrence. If we get a 3-foot, 3.4 tide, high tide, and some west wind behind it, it's like a river going over that road as the tide comes in. It's coming fast, and the projections are the rate of rise is just going to keep increasing. It's not going to be a straight line.
Karen also observes that all the salt flats are getting covered with mangroves in our area in Sarasota and Tampa Bay. So, I mean, obviously it's progressing more quickly, the farther south you are in Florida. And this is not a heavy question, Lunch and Learn so far. Do we have other plants that we're monitoring for changes? I know Brazilian pepper was something that came up a lot in our field trip with Dr. Poots.
I mean, as far as monitoring, the upside there is that so much of this coastline is public ownership, 2 major state parks, a national wildlife refuge, and so they do exercise some invasive plant control. So yeah, if we want to see the native plants and native plant communities be able to migrate inland, adapt to all the impacts of climate change, we need to reduce whatever stresses we can. So an invasive, non-native, like Brazilian pepper, is just going to make it more difficult. And something else I didn't really mention or highlight, I did bring up all the coastal rivers, the spring-run rivers, the tremendous amount of freshwater input we have along this coastline. We do see declines in spring flows and in river flows. And so another thing that really concerns me is this double whammy that we're going to have sea level rise pushing the saltwater in further. And the only thing that can really hold it back to some degree is the hydraulic pressure of all that freshwater bubble on the peninsula and all those freshwater rivers. And river, the more water we use, uh, and the more declines that we see in river flows, spring flows, groundwater levels, uh, the saltwater intrusion we're seeing now is, I'm afraid, going to be the tip of the iceberg. That was a little off topic, but
I mean, it's a pretty broad topic, sea level rise and its consequences. So, and Jen also comments, she says, sadly, until people get hit in the pocketbook, it's hard to motivate broader change, in our societal change. And she says that probably it's good that the financial markets are starting to recognize this.
I think insurance companies recognized it some time ago. Uh, the whole issue of more intense storms. Yes, they crunch numbers, and to them, it's not a matter of is climate change real. They see it in a very pragmatic dollars and cents way.
Yeah, I just posted in the chat an article, Moody's buys climate data firm signaling new scrutiny of climate risks. It's an article from the New York Times. So, they're a rating agency and they're buying a climate data firm in order to accurately measure the physical risks of climate change to better assess these bond, how to rate bonds better in the future. Deborah has a question, and she did give me some more information about this question. She says, is the migration problem at the 2-meter mark, the one you described so extensively earlier, is that due to human modified land rather than remnant, sandy land?
No, it's not. And I would want to caution, it's not the most sophisticated model. It looks at erosion and accretion, and so much of that is dependent on it's so site specific. There are other stretches of coastline that may react quite differently based on the substrate and the currents. But Wackasasa Bay, it's so flat that 2 meters of rise will just swamp a huge proportion of the land area of that park.
So it's an elevation and speed issue. Deborah, in her, she asks, she sort of points out, is the soil changed to a bog condition that the salt marshes cannot survive in? So she's sort of asking if there's some sort of soil issue rather than elevation issue.
Well, yeah, one of the most important parameters that we used in that model, as I recall, was what was called the salt elevation, the maximum elevation to which salt water had an influence. And I think that is really pretty critical as to whether these communities will be able to have the right combination of inundation and salinity. I'm not sure if that's really a good answer to the question. On coastlines where you have a pretty big rise in elevation, you're probably not going to see much impact moving far inland. But that intertidal zone, that's really where the big changes are going to happen. And so if you have a steep coastline, the impacts may not extend far inland. Maybe you have a rocky cliff there. But it also means that whatever kinds of coastal communities you have there, wetland or otherwise, barrier islands or salt marshes, there's going to be no place for them to go. Just caught in the pinch.
Hmm.
Between the devil and the deep blue sea, I think was a term that Tom Hochter used some years back to describe what's happening here along the Gulf Coast.
So I think she's maybe trying to visualize. I think I'm kind of seeing what she's doing. Is she's maybe trying to visualize a sandhill or some other like scrubby flatwoods turning into a marsh, and whether the way the sandhill or the scrubby flatwoods is would prevent this from happening, or if it would just, if sea level rise was not so quick, that it might transition perfectly fine.
It may, uh, and we ran the model to the year 2100, and as sea levels rise more than 2 meters, but we do have some areas of sandhill and oak scrub not too far inland, and could reach there. You know, the I think the most critical thing is that it's not hardened, so there is an ability for something to establish itself there. It may not be uh, like the salt marshes we have now. We might see uh, something quite different develop, but it can develop. There will be places for plants to grow, and hopefully support the wildlife, uh, sea life that we have now. Uh, but so much of our coastline, what happens when that intertidal zone has moved far enough where it's now an asphalt road or the concrete slab under somebody's house? There's not much that can happen there. I mean, that's really one of the imperatives for preserving as much natural coastline as we can. And I haven't used the term, but ultimately, we're going to have to be talking about strategic retreat. If we think that we can just put up higher and higher seawalls, and that's going to protect our cities uh, along the coastline and our homes, uh, that's not going to work. And even if Moody's was, yeah, even if you could find somebody to foot the bill to pay for those kinds of infrastructure, is it really a good investment? Is that where we should be putting our money?
And you just answered Margaret's question. She said, this may be a naive question, but what kinds of things can a city do to protect infrastructure from sea level rise? Any suggestions?
Well, and they're doing some of it. In Miami Beach, they're using pumps so that the impact of those really high tides is lessened, and the streets aren't flooded as deeply as often. But these are stop gaps. At some point you have to recognize it's going to keep rising. It's not going to stabilize anytime soon. And it's all on borrowed time. I have been reading, being in the Tampa Bay area, the city of St. Petersburg is looking at allowing higher densities in certain parts of the city
And I, it's a conundrum because there is, so much of our economy is rooted in this coastal real estate, and it's not in our nature to retreat, but I think we're going to have to get over that. And I use that term strategic retreat. So identify the areas most at risk and start thinking about retreat, and areas where you might be able to do some infrastructure improvements that will delay the inevitable and and minimize some of the detrimental economic impact and human impact. It's not just about money, it's people's homes and livelihoods. Um, Ultimately, we're just going to have to back off from the coastline because the coastline is it's never been a truly static thing. It's always been a dynamic place. The sea level rise, uh, you know, much more so. I I'm really curious to see what's going to happen to barrier islands. So much of our economy is tourism based. Uh, how long can we maintain barrier islands and beaches as a magnet for tourism? How many millions of dollars can we spend on beach nourishment projects before we run out of sand? And it ultimately, uh, a lot of it, now is to protect homes, and all you're doing is delaying the necessity to retreat. You can find maps of critically eroded beach in Florida, and it's all where the erosion is threatening human structures, human development. And if the way we're going to protect it is through hardening, through beach nourishment, putting up seawalls, at some point a seawall becomes a dike, not a seawall. And you're on the other side of that, on the water side of that seawall and dike, you're not going to have salt marsh, and mangroves, not long term. Is it going to be an attractive place to live? Is the sea still going to feed us the way it does now, when the acreage of healthy estuaries declines because we're losing all these coastal systems, coastal wetlands? It's a nightmare.
Yeah, it sure sounds like it. We have one last question that just popped up in the chat. Martha Sifness, who's a brand new member of the Pinellas chapter, has a bit of a personal question for you. Do you plan to stay on the island?
The house is on the market if you want to come take a look. It's another article just in the last week about the impact on real estate values, on houses, homes right on the coastline. It's the biggest hit is in places, high-end places in Miami Beach, but it's happening. And reality is eventually going to slap us in the face. There would be no denying how serious this is.
Well, hopefully a potential buyer for your house is not watching this Lunch and Learn.
Hey, it's a beautiful place to be, and 10 years from now, it probably still will be, 20 years, and for some people, that might be worth it.
Might be good enough. Yeah. I don't know if you're interested in continuing. We are past 110, so just so everybody knows, these Lunch and Learns are immediately available. It's like a DVR feature on YouTube Live, so you can go back to a part that you missed in the presentation or go back to the very beginning and watch it again right now, or later this afternoon or tomorrow. It's available immediately. So.
And I might ask, it was interesting to hear about the red mangroves up there, St. George Island, I think you said. If anybody out there has other observations, please share them with us. If you didn't bring them up today, or we ran out of time, or you didn't really think of them, I do have an email address. I think it's fnps.policy@fnps.org. You can reach me there, and please share your observations so we can add them to all the information we're trying to share, help drive home the reality of what's happening. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Eugene. We have one request to perhaps elaborate on strategic retreat. I don't know if you're interested in continuing on, maybe discussing Yankeetown's plans, comprehensive plan.
I don't mind staying on the line. Just somebody has a specific question about it.
Just Margaret, she's in Pinellas. She's been asking most of the questions, and she did say maybe elaborate on strategic retreat. So if you do have anything else you'd like to say, she would probably be interested.
Well, Yankeetown, it's a small place, but they have developed a strategy document. And coincidentally, they put it together not long after I left the Nature Conservancy, and they used the SLAM modeling that we did as part of that study to help them identify the areas most at risk and to kind of characterize the changes that were likely going to come. I'm not really sure how far they've gone with implementation of that. I'd be interested to find out. I sure wish other communities could follow their lead. If anything, it would at least reflect that they're starting to think about what's going to happen. I hate to think of the investments we can make on the coastline just being a waste, not just wasted money, but exacerbated the way it's going to impact the natural systems. The more hardening we do, rephrase it, the less hardening we do, the better.
The better. Yeah, we could talk in positive terms. Just discourage your county and city governments from doing any additional unnecessary hardening.
And it is the first, build your seawall higher. It's the first reaction.
Yeah.
But to what end? Where does it stop?
Quite, yes. So, well, there's no further questions, and it looks like people are hopping off more or less, so it's probably a good time to say thanks, Gene, for giving us this really amazing presentation.
Well, thanks. I was glad to join you all.
And you're getting a lot of thanks in the chat. So, yeah.
You're very welcome.
And for continuing on this theme of depressing lunch and learns, next week we have Wesley Knapp, who is the lead author of a study estimating the extinction rate in vascular plants in North America. So he is very charismatic and interesting, and he'll be talking to us about vascular plant extinction from the southeast perspective of the southeastern United States. He's based in North Carolina. So that should be very interesting lunch and learn, and I'm excited to have him on. So I'll see everyone next week, and have a good Friday and weekend, everyone.
Bye, everybody.